The morning of the 14th of October, 1817, the Church of St. Edmund on Walcott Street was full. Candles in silver brackets lit the nave. The Harwick pew gleamed with new ribbon. Cecily Vane, in ivory silk trimmed with Mechlin lace, stood at the altar beside Edmund Harwick, Earl of Harwick, and the vicar had reached the legal portion of the ceremony. The solemn charge that precedes all vows when a man in a gray coat entered through the south door and made his way, with visible discomfort, toward the front of the assembled congregation. The vicar faltered. Edmund turned. The man in the gray coat was a clerk from the offices of the principal registry, and what he carried was a sealed document and an expression of considerable professional unhappiness. He leaned close to the vicar and spoke in a voice that was meant to be a whisper and was not. The first Countess of Harwick signed no divorce, the clerk said. The petition was never completed. The marriage to Eleanor Farwell Harwick stands in law. This ceremony cannot proceed. The silence that followed was the kind that precedes a heavy thing falling. Cecily Vane's hand released Edmund's arm. Her mother, seated in the second row, made a sound that was not quite a word. Lady Miriam Harwick, the Dowager Countess, seated at the aisle end of the front pew, in gray silk and pearls, did not move at all. Only her fan, which had been resting open across her lap, slowly closed. He stood very still. He had a jaw that carried tension the way stone carries cold, and it held that quality now, though his face had gone a shade that had no name except the absence of ordinary feeling. He looked at the clerk. He looked at the document. He said nothing for a long moment that every person in the church was counting. "This is not possible," he said at last, and his voice was level, and that was all he said. 300 miles north and west, in a house at the edge of the village of Monkton Parva in Shropshire, Eleanor Harwick was teaching arithmetic. She did not yet know that in a London church a marriage had just collapsed on her behalf. She knew only that the morning light came through the schoolroom window at an angle that turned the dust on the sill to gold, that Thomas Briggs in the third row had finally grasped long division, and that her fire needed feeding before the 11 o'clock lesson. She taught 14 children in a schoolroom built onto the side of her father's old house, which was now her house, which had been her house for 3 years. The children were the sons and daughters of tenant farmers and village tradesmen, and Eleanor taught them reading, writing, arithmetic, and a little natural history on Fridays, and they paid in whatever their parents could spare, which was sometimes money, and sometimes a dressed fowl, and sometimes nothing at all. She was 31 years old. She wore plain gray wool in winter, and plain blue muslin in summer, and kept her brown hair in a simple knot, because there was no one to dress it properly, and she would not pretend otherwise. The women of the village called her Mrs. Harwick, which was correct in law, and the women of whatever remained of her social acquaintance in the county called her nothing at all, having decided years ago that she was a curiosity best left unvisited. The house itself was modest by any standard she had known before her marriage. 2 stories of Shropshire sandstone with a garden that produced more weeds than blooms, and a roof that let in rain at the northeast corner when the wind was wrong. Her father had lived in it for the last 20 years of his life, teaching village children there as she taught them now, which was either coincidence or the kind of inheritance that runs in the blood without anyone naming it. She had not set out to be her father. She had set out once to be the Countess of Harwick, which had been a different ambition entirely, and that ambition had closed itself off with the particularity of a door locked from the other side. She had not spent 3 years mourning it. She had simply done what was in front of her. She had taught reading and arithmetic, and the names of birds, and the method of long division. She had eaten soup. She had kept the house warm enough, and the fire fed and the children's fees at a rate their parents could manage. She had done, in short, what any sensible woman does when the life she expected fails to arrive. She had built a smaller, more honest one from whatever materials were at hand. The cost of that honesty was that she did not speak of the marriage, not to anyone. The village knew she was married, and that her husband was an earl, and that she lived alone, and they had supplied the rest of the story themselves. which Eleanor permitted because the true story would have required her to say the name of the child she had lost, and that name was her own business and no one else's. She had been called other things in her absence from London. She knew this because Mr. Purgay Dibley, the apothecary's assistant, and a man incapable of silence, had arrived at her door in September with a delivery of quinine, and the intelligence that Lady Harwick had been heard referring to her, in correspondence with the family solicitor, as the ghost wife. A phrase which Dibley found highly interesting, and Eleanor found useful, in a way she did not explain to him. It told her that the dowager still thought of her as something already past. It told her that the new marriage was close. She had not signed the papers. She had been asked to, twice, by letters from a solicitor she did not recognize, conveying terms she found insufficient and courtesy she found absent, and she had declined both times. She had written her own solicitor in Bath, a Mr. Graves, a patient and thorough man, and she had told him she would not consent to a dissolution of the marriage without the conversation she had been waiting for 3 years to have. Edmund had not come. His mother's solicitor had told Mr. Graves that the Earl did not wish to meet. Eleanor had read that letter twice carefully, and then she had folded it precisely and placed it in the box on her dressing table, where she kept 2 other things, her father's watch and the white gloves she had worn on the morning of her wedding, which were still perfectly white, preserved in tissue paper, and which she had not thrown away, because doing so had seemed like agreeing to something she had not agreed to. She had not agreed to any of it. She had simply endured it. The letter from Mr. Fatir, the letter. Graves arrived on the 16th of October, 2 days after the ceremony that was not a ceremony had concluded in St. Edmund's on Walcott Street. She was eating soup when he knocked, and she put down her spoon with the particular care she had learned to apply to small domestic actions when a larger thing was coming. Mr. Stom Graves stood in her sitting room in his traveling coat, which meant he had come himself rather than posted the letter, which meant the matter was not simple. The Earl's new marriage has been suspended, he said carefully. The registry discovered the irregularity the morning of the ceremony. He has retained separate counsel. There will be a formal hearing before the magistrate to determine the legal standing of the original marriage and whether the divorce petition was properly served. You are required to appear. Eleanor looked at him for a moment. Required, she said. I am afraid so, and the dowager. Mr. Graves hesitated with the precision of a man who had practiced the hesitation. I understand Lady Harwick is taking a significant interest in the proceedings. Eleanor thought of the phrase the ghost wife and the ease with which it had been used. She thought of the white gloves in the box upstairs. Waiting. How soon? She said. A fortnight. I've arranged lodgings on Jermyn Street. She nodded once, the way she nodded at the end of an arithmetic lesson when the sum had come correct. Then I will come, she said. That evening she went upstairs and stood in front of her wardrobe for a longer time than was strictly necessary for a woman who owned 4 dresses. She had nothing suitable for a formal legal hearing in London, and she had no one to advise her on the question, and the question itself struck her as both trivially small and deeply important in the way that only preparation for something frightening can make a small thing important. She chose the dark green wool. It was not fashionable. It was well made and still sound, and she had nothing better, and she was not going to London to appear fashionable. She was going to London to stand in a room full of people who had decided, in her absence, what she was and what she wanted and what she deserved, and she was going to tell them, clearly and without drama, what was true. She closed the wardrobe. She sat at the small dressing table and looked at the box with her father's watch and the folded gloves inside it. She did not open it. She simply placed her hand on the lid for a moment, the way one checks that a thing is still where one left it. Then she went to inform the parents of her 14 students that the school would close for a fortnight. If you've ever wondered what it costs a woman to walk back into the room that swallowed her, stay a little. This story does not spare the cost. It only insists on naming what she brought with her when she walked. The hearing was set for the 3rd of November, But the Earl's man of business called at Jermyn Street on the afternoon of the 1st, and Eleanor received him in the small sitting room that smelled of the previous tenant's pipe tobacco, and he told her the Earl wished to know if she would agree to meet with his solicitor to review the evidence. She said she would review the evidence with her own solicitor present. Edmund arrived himself that evening. She had not expected that. Mr. Graves had not expected it. The man of business who was left waiting in the hall clearly had not expected it either. Eleanor was standing at the window when the knock came, and she turned to find Edmund in the doorway of her sitting room, and for a moment neither of them spoke, and the room held both of them inside the particular silence of 3 years and a stopped clock. He was thinner than she remembered, though not unwell. He wore a dark coat, and his cravat was tied with the severe precision she had always associated with his public appointments. His hair was darker in the lamplight. His face was the face she knew, which was harder than she had let herself remember, and which was giving nothing away except at the jaw, where a muscle moved once and was controlled. She had made herself a rule. She would not be the first to speak. He was not a man who struggled with words as a general principle. He struggled now. She watched him find a sentence and discard it and find another. "I did not know," he said. The words came out level and separate, like stones placed in a line. "I assumed as much," she said. "Eleanor?" He stopped. He had used her Christian name without appearing to decide to, and the sound of it in his voice, after 3 years, moved through her before she could prevent it. She was careful not to let it show. "You should speak with Mr. Gapley." "Graves," she said. "The hearing is the day after tomorrow. I came to tell you myself that the error was not mine. I believed you when I read the petition," she said quietly. "I believed you had sent it. I did not believe you had come with it yourself, which is rather why I sent it back." Unsigned, something shifted in his face. A very small thing, the kind of shift that has nothing to do with composure and everything to do with what composure is hiding. "You waited," he said. It was not quite a question. "For 3 years," she said. "Yes." He stood there a moment longer. Then he said good night, and he left, and Eleanor sat down in the chair by the cold fire, and did not allow herself to feel the full weight of what had just occurred until well after she heard the carriage move away. London had felt, for the first 2 days, like a coat she had outgrown. The streets were loud after Shropshire. The buildings pressed in. The air had a quality she had forgotten. Coal smoke and river damp and the smell of a great many people living in close company. And she had stood at the Jermyn Street window the first morning and watched the crossing sweeper at work below, and thought about Thomas Briggs and his multiplication tables, and the low grey light of Shropshire mornings, and had allowed herself precisely 10 minutes of that before she put on the dark green wool and asked for her breakfast. Mr. Graves had called in the afternoon. He was a deliberate man in his middle 50s, grey-coated, with the kind of patient face that acquires authority not from severity, but from an absolute refusal to be surprised by anything. He had laid out the situation in orderly terms. The documents his office had assembled, the evidence of the irregular address, the testimony Eleanor would be asked to provide, which was simple. What she had received, what she had returned, what she had never received at all. He told her to speak plainly and to say nothing she was not certain of, and she told him she had no intention of doing otherwise, and he looked at her over his spectacles with an expression she recognized as professional approval. She had not expected Edmund to come before the hearing. She had thought there would be formal channels, measured distance, the procedural courtesy of strangers, navigating a legal difficulty. She had prepared herself for that. She had not prepared herself for him standing in her doorway in the lamplight, with the exact posture she remembered from 6 years of marriage and 3 years of absence, still and slightly too careful, as though he was working out what the room required of him. The hearing was held in a long room in a building off the Strand, before a magistrate named Sir Charles Wellow, a deliberate man with silver spectacles and a reputation for patience with complicated domestic matters. The principals were ranged on opposite sides of a long table. Edmund on one side with his counsel, Eleanor and Mr. Graves on the other. Lady Miriam Harwick arrived 20 minutes late and took a chair against the wall, behind and to the right of her son, wearing charcoal silk and a hat with a dark feather, and she did not look at Eleanor when she sat. Mrs. Kess Vane, Cecily's mother, arrived with her own solicitor. She was a stout woman in puce taffeta who had invested considerably in her daughter's position and had discovered, over the preceding fortnight, that the return on that investment was negative, and someone was responsible. Cecily herself was not present, and Eleanor was quietly grateful for that. The proceedings were formal and slow. Documents were introduced. The original marriage register, the record of the petition, the record of service which Mr. Maxter Graves indicated was irregular. The Harwick family solicitor, a Mr. Payne, explained that the petition had been properly filed. Mr. Graves explained that the service to Eleanor's address in Shropshire had been made to an address she had not occupied since February of 1814, 3 years before the attempt. Sir Charles Wellow looked at the address. He looked at Mr. Payne. Mr. Payne looked at the wall. Lady Harwick's fan was closed in her lap. It was during the account of the miscarriage that the room changed. Edmund had not been expected to speak. His counsel was speaking. Then Edmund said quietly, "If I may," and his counsel stopped. He spoke for perhaps 3 minutes. He was not asking for sympathy, and the plainness of his account made that clear. He said only that in November of 1814, Eleanor had lost a child in the 5th month, that she had gone to her sister's house afterward, and had written to say she needed time, that he had written back one letter in February of 1815, a letter whose coldness he recognized now, but had not recognized then, because the grief had shut something in him that he did not know how to open, that he had received no reply, that his mother had told him Eleanor had no wish to return to London, that he had not questioned it. He stopped. The room was very quiet. Eleanor was looking at the table. She was aware that her hands were absolutely still in her lap, which was costing her something. She had received no letter, not in February of 1815, not in any other month. She had written to him twice after the loss of the child and received no answer, and his mother's solicitor had told Mr. Samper. Graves the Earl did not wish to meet, and she had interpreted his silence as the same grief turned to coldness that she could not reach, and had stopped trying to reach. They had been 2 people in the same stopped room, with Lady Harwick standing between them, and neither of them had known the room existed. Mrs. Vane's voice, cutting across the quiet, was perfectly timed to be the worst possible sound. "One pities the Earl's situation," she said to the woman beside her, in a voice calibrated to carry. Shackled still to a ghost wife who refused out of spite to release him. Graves put his hand over Eleanor's and pressed it once briefly. Sir Charles Wellow looked at Mrs. Vane over his silver spectacles. "Madam," he said, "you are here as an interested party, not as a commentator on the character of those present. I will ask you to remember the distinction." Mrs. Vane did not appear to find this remark addressed to her. Eleanor looked up. She found Edmund looking at her, and she did not know what her face was doing, but his had changed. Not much. The jaw was the same. The eyes were not. She had a theory which she had never told anyone about why she had not signed the papers. It was not the reason she had given her solicitor, which was that the terms were insufficient and the process irregular, though both were true. It was not even entirely the reason she had given herself, which was that she was waiting for a conversation. She was owed. The truth was smaller and less dignified. The truth was that she had been waiting to find out if she had been wrong about him. If the man she had married, the man who had been so inept at grief that he had gone cold rather than open, who had written one letter in a formal hand when what she needed was for him to appear at her door, that man, underneath the ineptitude, had loved her with the kind of intention she had married him, believing he possessed. She had needed to know before she signed anything whether she had been mistaken about that from the beginning, or only about his ability to show it. 3 years in Shropshire had not answered the question. Neither had the unsigned papers. This room, today, with his voice breaking slightly on the word child and his body very still in the chair, and his eyes on her now, not with performance but with something that could not perform because it had no audience in mind, this was beginning to answer it. If there was a moment the clock in him started again, it was then, and she did not yet know it. That evening, Lady Harwick came to Jermyn Street. Eleanor did not invite her in. They stood in the doorway, the dowager on the step, and Eleanor in the frame of the door. And Lady Harwick spoke with the measured care of a woman who had been composing the speech since she left the hearing. "The matter is regrettable," Lady Harwick said. "Mr. Payne exercised poor judgment in the matter of the address. I take responsibility for the instruction I gave him, which was to proceed expeditiously. I did not know you had moved." Eleanor looked at her. She had known the dowager for 6 years, which was long enough to read the pauses in her sentences. "You knew I had moved," Eleanor said. "I wrote to inform Edmund of my Shropshire direction in the spring of 1814. You intercepted the letter, or you gave it to him, and removed his reply. One or the other." Lady Harwick's expression did not change, which was itself an answer. "I believed it was best for Edmund," she said. "You believed Cecily was best for Edmund. She has £25,000 and a family without difficulty." "Yes," Eleanor said. "I had noticed those qualities do not include me." She stepped back from the door, not to invite the dowager in, only to look at her more clearly. "Your son lost 3 years of his marriage to a dead child, and a wrong address on a legal form. I lost the same. I would like you to think about whether that was worth what you intended it to achieve." Lady Harwick looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in her face that Eleanor did not expect. Something not quite contrition but adjacent to it. The expression of a woman who has been entirely certain for a very long time, and has found, for the first time, a crack in the certainty. Then the dowager pulled her mantle closer, nodded once, and left. Eleanor closed the door, and stood in the hallway with her back to it. Edmund was in the hall. She had not heard him arrive, or she had heard the knock and assumed it was someone else. Or she had been too concentrated on his mother to notice. He was standing at the end of the hall with his hat in his hands, and his coat still on, and he had clearly heard everything, because his face was the face of a man who has just been handed the full accounting of a debt he did not know he owed. "She never gave you the letter," he said. "No, I wrote to you in February." He stopped. "It was a terrible letter. I knew it when I wrote it. I sent it because I did not know how else to reach you, and I was afraid of what you would say if I came in person, and when I received nothing in return, I told myself, the silence was your answer." Eleanor watched him. She had imagined this conversation many times in 3 years, in the small house in Shropshire, on long evenings when the school was empty and the fire was low. She had imagined it with anger, with cool precision, occasionally with the kind of grief that has nowhere to go. She had not imagined it quite like this. "What would you have done?" she said carefully. "If I had," replied he, looked at her. "I would have come," he said, "immediately, and said what I should have said in the first place, which is that I did not know how to carry the loss of the child without you, and that asking you to be the only one who could help me was more than I had any right to ask, and that I asked it anyway, because I was not wise and I was not generous, and I had no idea what to do with grief, except stand still and hope the cold would eventually pass." Eleanor was quiet for a long time. "It does pass," she said finally. "Mostly." He nodded. He was still holding his hat. He was not a man who forgot he was holding his hat. "I am not asking you for anything tonight," he said. "I wanted you to know what I would have done." She did not stop him from leaving. She almost did. That was the thing she admitted to herself only after the carriage was gone and the street outside was quiet. She had stood in the hallway with his hand not quite reaching hers, with the particular cold of a November evening in London coming through the gap under the door, and she had thought, very clearly, that she could say his name. That was all. She could say his name, and he would stop and turn, and the conversation they had been circling for 3 years would begin in earnest rather than in the careful, measured installments of a legal proceeding. She had thought it with complete clarity. She had said nothing. She had let him go because there was still one more public thing required, and she had learned, in 3 years of being alone, that the private moments are not real until the public ones are resolved. She would not begin something tonight that tomorrow might take back. The following morning she wrote to Thomas Briggs's mother to say the school would reopen the week after next, and that she would bring back paper from London, which was a promise she fully intended to keep. She reread the letter twice. Then she folded it and posted it, and went downstairs to have her breakfast, and sat in the small sitting room that smelled of the previous tenant's pipe tobacco, and looked at the grey London morning, and did not permit herself to think about the hallway for more than a moment or two. The formal adjudication took place on the 7th of November, in the same long room off the Strand. The room was fuller than it had been. Todd had circulated, as it always does in London, not through deliberate communication but through the particular osmosis of a society in which everyone knows everyone else's household staff. Mrs. Vane had brought 3 additional members of her party. A correspondent for a small gazette had been seen in the corridor. Lady Harwick arrived precisely on time, in black this time, with the particular stillness of a woman who has spent the night deciding what kind of composure is still available to her. Sir Charles Wellow reviewed the documents. He noted the irregularity in the service. He noted the evidence that the address used had been vacated before the petition was served. He noted that Eleanor Farwell Harwick had at no point signed any instrument of dissolution, and that the petition had been filed in her name without her completion of the requisite steps. His conclusion was not long in coming. The marriage of Edmund Francis Harwick, Earl of Harwick, and Eleanor Farwell Harwick, entered in the register at St. George's on the 14th of May, 1812, was and had always been the only valid marriage on record. The ceremony of the 14th of October was null. Miss Vane's position in the matter carried no legal stain. Mrs. Vane's solicitor rose to speak. He began with, "My client's position as a wronged party," and had reached the ghost wife's refusal to cooperate with reasonable proceedings when the Earl stood up. He did not raise his voice. He crossed the room in 4 deliberate strides, and he stood between Eleanor's chair and the rest of the room, and he turned to face Sir Charles Wellow, and then the assembled company. And he spoke. "Eleanor Harwick is my wife," he said. "She has always been my wife." 12 words. The sentence was not poetic. It was not the speech of a man attempting to impress anyone. It was simply the plainest possible description of a legal and personal fact, stated in a voice that left no opening for amendment. Mrs. Vane's solicitor sat down. Lady Harwick's fan did not open. Miss Vane's mother made a sound. It began as a protest, and ended as something that could not quite find its shape. Sir Charles Wellow looked at Edmund over his spectacles, with the expression of a man who has seen many things in a long career, and finds this one, on the whole, satisfactory. Eleanor was looking at Edmund's back. The breadth of his shoulders in the dark coat, the stillness of his hands at his sides. She was thinking of the letter she had never received, and the letter she had sent that had never arrived, and the 3 years in between, and the white gloves folded in tissue paper on her dressing table in Shropshire, and the 14 children in the schoolroom who were expecting her on Monday morning. She was thinking that she had spent 3 years building a life that required nothing, and asked for nothing, because it seemed the safest kind of life available, and that safety was a different thing from want, and she had been confusing them for some time. Lady Harwick rose from her chair and left the room before the proceedings were formally concluded. She did not look at Eleanor. She did not look at her son. She carried herself with a composure that had shifted from authority into dignity, which was a smaller thing but still hers. And Eleanor did not watch her go with anything approaching triumph. The Harwick solicitor, Mr. Mine, Payne followed at some distance, looking at the floor. Miss Vane's party gathered themselves and departed with what grace was available. Sir Charles Wellow closed his folio and indicated that the matter was resolved to his satisfaction, and that anyone with further questions might consult the registry on a following day. The room emptied. Edmund turned from the center of it and found Eleanor still seated, and Mr. Graves standing beside her chair with his folio under his arm and the long table between them, no longer carrying any documents, only the marks of a morning's proceedings and the faint smell of tallow from the overhead fixtures. Graves said he would give them a moment. He said it to neither of them in particular, and then he was gone, with the discreet efficiency of a man who has practiced knowing when to leave. Eleanor stood. It was not a grand gesture. She stood because she had been sitting for a long time, and she was tired in a way that had very little to do with sitting. "You did not have to say it in those terms," she said. "I know," Edmund said. He came closer, stopping at a proper distance, his hat under his arm now, the lamplight on the side of his face. "I wanted there to be no ambiguity. There was not much ambiguity left in the legal determination." "I did not mean the legal determination." She looked at him carefully. He was looking at her with an attention she recognized and had been pretending for 3 years she did not recognize. The attention of a man reading something he cannot afford to misread. "I am not the same person I was in 1812, she said. "No," he said. "Neither am I. I have a school in Shropshire that I am not willing to abandon. I would not ask you to abandon it. I would need to return there regularly." "Yes," he said, as though this were the simplest thing in the world, as though it had already been decided some time ago, and only needed stating. "I would come with you." She was quiet for a moment. "And the room smelled of tallow and paper and the particular flat cold of November in a city building. "There is a great deal we have not said," she said. "We have time," he said. "We have had 3 years of not saying it. We can use some of the same time to say it instead." The ghost of something crossed his face that was not quite the thing she knew as his expression. Something softer, something that had been there once, and was returning like a light coming back into a room when the shutter is opened. She did not say yes. She did not need to. She said, "I will need to go back on Monday for the school." And he said, "I know." And that was the whole of the agreement. And it was enough. He crossed to her. He stopped close, closer than the legal distance the hearing had held between them, and she could see the precise line where his cravat met the high collar of his coat, and the faint shadow at his jaw that meant the morning shave was some hours past. His hand came up and touched her wrist, not the bare skin, only the wool of her sleeve, and she felt it through the fabric the way one feels a sound rather than hears it, not in the ear but in the chest. He held that point of contact. That was all. It was nothing. Measured in any currency, the marriage market understood. It was not a declaration. It was not an embrace. It was a hand at a wrist through a gray wool sleeve, in an empty room that smelled of tallow, between 2 people who had spent 3 years in the same arrested silence without knowing they were in it together. She turned her hand, slightly so that the inside of her wrist was against his fingers. His breath was audible once, as though he had been holding it for some time. They stood there until a door, somewhere in the building, opened and closed, and reminded them that the world had not stopped while they were in it. He lowered his hand. She did not look away from his face. "Monday," he said. "Monday," she agreed. Monkton Parva, in December, was gray and cold and absolutely itself, which Eleanor had always found a comfort. The schoolroom fire was lit by 7 in the morning, and Thomas Briggs had graduated to multiplication tables, and the youngest of the children, a girl called Nan, who was 5, and had been brought by her older brother, had learned to write her name in a hand that slanted hopefully to the right. Edmund came on the Thursday following. He arrived in a traveling carriage that was considerably finer than anything that had passed through the village in recent memory, and Mr. Dibley, the apothecary's assistant, was seen watching its progress from his doorway with an expression of deep professional interest. Eleanor saw him from the schoolroom window and felt something in her chest that was not quite relief and not quite anticipation, and was perhaps the simplest version of both. The recognition that a thing which had been absent had returned, and that the house would be different this evening than it had been the evening before. He stayed, not that week only, but the next, and the weeks after, occupying the small second bedroom that had been her father's study and that she had never converted to any other purpose because she had not known what else to do with it. He did not crowd the school. He asked sensible questions about long division, and was shown by Thomas Briggs how it worked. He helped with the fire when she was occupied with lessons. He sat in the evenings in the opposite chair from hers and read, and the silence between them was entirely unlike the stopped silence of 3 years, being instead the kind of silence that has room in it for two people to exist simultaneously without either of them having to perform anything. In the evenings they talked. Not all at once and not in the tidy way of a story that has a clean accounting, but in the manner of two people returning to a conversation that had been interrupted a very long time ago, picking up threads and following them until they met other threads, and sometimes the threads led somewhere difficult and they went there anyway, because the alternative was to leave them lying. He told her about the letter, the full letter, not a summary. She listened without filling the pauses. She told him about the 2 letters she had sent. He listened the same way. And she told him she had kept the white gloves. He was quiet for a long time after that, looking at the fire. Then he said, "I am glad you kept them." She brought the box down from the dressing table the following evening and opened it on the table between them. The watch was her father's, a gold pocket watch with a dented case. The gloves were still white, still folded in their tissue paper, still waiting in the way that things wait when they have not been given a resolution. She lifted them out and turned them over in her hands once. Then she put them, carefully, in the small lacquered drawer of the side table, the one that closed, properly, and did not stick in damp weather. She closed the drawer. Edmund watched her close it. His face in the firelight held the expression she had not seen in 3 years, the one that was not composed and not cold and had nothing to perform for anyone. "They are at rest now," she said. "Yes," he said. Outside the schoolroom window, the first snow of December had begun to fall on Monkton Parva. It fell on the churchyard and the apothecary's sign and the low rooftops and the lane that ran down to the river, and it made the village smaller and quieter and entirely itself, and the fire in Eleanor's sitting room burned warm and steady against the dark. The white gloves were in the drawer. The school would be full in the morning. He stayed. "Thank you for sitting with Eleanor through this. If her patience moved you, or if you know what it is to wait for a conversation that is long overdue, leave a word in the comments. It means more than you know."